Let me just jump right to the news of the afternoon. It wasn't even this morning. Oil tankers been attacked in the last days in the Persian Gulf. Secretary of State Pompeo has just named Iran as the culprit. Are we heading to war?
I think if they did it, which he believes the evidence which he said he was accumulating, and the way these things work, and what I would be instructing the building to be doing at this time is to accumulate all the information that we have surely collected but not yet pulled together yet. But if Secretary Pompeo's convinced of that, much of that must have happened already. I think if the Iranians did this, and according to him, it wasn't just proxies,
right?
And so he attributes it to the Iranian government, which I would do in any event, even if it was proxy. I think it's important to sustain the principle that the act of proxies is the act of the...
Well, how proxy can you be if you're operating in a maritime setting?
Yes,
right off?
You can make that argument.
You can
make that argument in Gulf shipping. However, if they were to attack U.S. forces in Syria, you might say they're proxies too. Again, I think the principle that an attack by a proxy has to be treated as an attack by the sponsoring government is an important one. So either way, in this case, I think once we collect all the information, so the response is going to be necessary. Now, Secretary Pompeo, as you probably noted, talked only about political and economic responses,
right,
and not military responses. It gets back to your question. I think I would nevertheless be at least preparing options for military responses.
What would your, sorry to use a fraught expression from your White House, but what would your red line be for the U.S. to take action, military action in the Gulf?
Well, the lesson I have learned from observing red lines over a number of decades, a number of presidents, including President Obama, is don't draw them in the first place.
The first rule of red lines is don't
so
have
I'm not
red
going to
lines.
do that.
Right.
I'm not going to, unless you clearly see what the purpose is, don't do it. I do think were they to take any action like that against a U.S. military vessel, that's top of the tier. Then you get U.S. flagged vessels, of which there are almost none there. So in this case, this is international shipping. But again, I think some action will probably be taken. Mike Pompeo says so. But, we're in the very early hours now.
Right.
And as I say some in the book, how do you manage circumstances like this? I was in office when we learned that 10 U.S. sailors had been taken prisoner or hostage or whatever, or detained by the Iranian military. And again, in these fast moving situations, you got to keep your wits about you. And the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what do I feel safe saying? And that's why it took some hours, I guess, for Mike Pompeo. And he's probably pretty careful about what he said about political and economic response. And don't get out in front of your headlights because you're under it. People are screaming for you to say something. And the other thing is you got to give people some actions to take. And so it's important that Acting Secretary Shanahan, I'm sure he is, and Pompeo are doing some things now. First of all, it shows that you're alive and awake, and that's important. Second, it gives your...
It's a low standard for government.
Well, but but I think otherwise there becomes a narrative of inaction, which is a narrative of not knowing what your mind is, which is not the same thing as not completely knowing all the facts of a given situation. So it is important to say something, and it is important to do something early in the hours of a crisis, even if you don't fully know everything, because you kind of, so to speak, have to fill the void. And that's just one of the lessons of having been around for a while and doing these kinds of things.
Let me ask you this, because we're in a unique situation. I want to come back to Iran specifically in a second, but we're in a unique situation. We've been in a long, unique situation. The X factor in this is Secretary of State, acting Secretary of Defense, obviously can think through measured response where words are calibrated to signal certain ideas. But then there's the phenomenon of late night tweeting or early morning tweeting. I mean, how do you? And you worked for the most disciplined, one of the most disciplined presidents in history, and we have now, I think it's fair to say, one of the lesser most disciplined presidents in history. How would you? Can a tweet at this point cause a move toward something kinetic?
I don't think a tweet would be construed as an order, if that's your question.
Well, that's half of the question. Could the other side misinterpret it?
Let's just be clear. Yeah. So the other side, yes, these tweets are more consequential. Now, if you had to predict what kind of tweet might come out of this particular circumstance with respect to Iran, given the president's history of tweeting on Iran, it's likely to be softer than anything Secretary Pompeo had to say, and he already was only talking about political and military response. Now, that's on the outside looking in and just trying to read.
He's been all over the spectrum, on Iran tweets. The North Korea tweets have been pretty soft, but Iran, he's gone hard on occasion.
I think Iran, he has consistently in recent months dismissed the prospect of imminent war much more, and that may have been a reaction to what his national security advisor, more than his Secretary of State, was saying. So again, that's tea leaf reading, but that's what you have right now. But I think the Iranians have already read the collective tea leaves, and what Pompeo said today was that they told us some time ago they were going to begin to react to the regime of pressure that they're under, sanctions pressure, and that we would see that reaction. That was Mike Pompeo's unfolding of what we've seen over the last not just 18 hours, but over the last 6 or 8 weeks or so.
Talk about this crisis, the larger crisis that predates this afternoon. It seems to a lot of people like we're in a at least semi-manufactured crisis, which is to say the JCPOA was working within the borders of what the JCPOA said it would do. And then there was the pullout, and then there was...
This is not within those borders, though.
No. I'm saying, generally speaking, the relationship, the situation was a status quo relationship. Which party, the Trump administration or Iran, is more responsible for ramping up this crisis?
Well, just to put the nuclear thing in perspective for everyone, the JCPOA was a good agreement, and I testified to that effect as Secretary of Defense because it took off the table one of my possible future headaches. But it did not take all of the headaches off. It was not, could never have been a grand bargain. And in particular, it didn't deal with this kind of situation. Threats to freedom of navigation in the Gulf or use of proxies in other conflicts or missile tests or anything else. It wasn't my expectation that it would, but it didn't, and therefore we had to continue to deal with all these other kinds of issues. I think in that context, there may have been a belief by some, I didn't particularly share it myself, that would make resolving issues like the current ones we have a little easier, and that maybe the scope of agreement would have expanded from nuclear to other things, but that was really aspirational, and I think rather unrealistic at that time. I certainly didn't have that aspiration.
You and Secretary Kerry definitely differed on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a difference between a hope and a prediction. He may have hoped that would happen. I don't know if you asked him, did he think it was going to happen or not? I didn't think it was going to happen, and I didn't even have the hope, so maybe the hope was the difference. But at any rate, well, it's fine to have hopes, but in that case, I don't think it was well-grounded one. Now, not just because of the JCPOA, but because of another number of things that have happened since, you can't have that expectation at all. You know, one of the sad things, Jeff, that history has dealt us is it really is a shame that, and one of the reasons I was pessimistic about our ability to turn the JCPO into a larger thing is we haven't had a very big history. I've been observing this now, and part of it for a number of decades. The attempts at outreach very broadly with the Iranian government in the course of my time in national security affairs have not been very productive at all. And so one of the sadnesses of history is that a culture that is in many ways one of the most together of the entire Middle East, and a state that is the most together in the sense of having a middle class and an artisanal and professional culture, and sort of namely Iran, and a great culture, namely the Persian culture, is so miserably run.
Right. But let me come back to that. The question is, who is responsible for what seems to be, let's call it an unnecessary crisis over Iran and its malign activities right now?
Well, I'm not there with you in the sense that you're attributing our confrontation with them over other things than nuclear, all their other malign activities.
Do you think if President Trump had not
and
pulled
our
out,
application of sanctions because of those other activities as us manufacturing a crisis? I rather think of it as them manufacturing provocations, which our sanctions are a response to, and that inevitably leading to a certain amount of brinksmanship on both sides.
I won't beat this horse forever, but if the Trump administration had not pulled out, rejected the JCPOA, do you think we'd be here today?
Might have been, because they'd still be doing this kind of stuff. They still had the mines. They were still working. Remember, even with the JCPOA possibly in place, I don't exactly remember the timing, they were equipping basically Houthi splinters with the same kind of stuff, with the idea that they might attack U.S. naval vessels west of the Arabian Peninsula. So they've been at this for quite a long time, and I don't think that the activities of the IRGC would have ended with the JCPOA. I mean, it's fine for us to take responsibility for negotiating and then walking away from the JCPOA. As I said, I would not have given that advice. Right. At the same time, that doesn't create, that's not the original sin that leads to all evil.
Was it a mistake, in retrospect, on the part of the Obama administration to limit its negotiations with Iran to the nuclear file and not to terrorist activities, ballistic missile activities, other malign activities?
I'm guessing that history would reveal, I don't remember the origins of that, but I think what history would reveal is that was the thing that was the most important. In other words, if you added that to this pile of stuff we already had in the way of serious security beefs with the state of Iran, that might be the straw that broke the camel's back. And for me, as Secretary of Defense, everything else I can find a way to handle. I don't want to have a war with Iran, but I know who will win. And nuclear wars are not something that anybody wins in the traditional military sense. I'd prefer not to have that choice in the hands of Iran. So in that sense, a very sober calculation could have led you to make that the priority. They may have also thought that was the one thing they're more likely to get out of the Iranians. It's one thing that the country is most likely to support. In the end event, it didn't. Right. But a nuclear deal more than a broader deal with the mullahs. Right. And so for all those reasons, it was a reasonable thing to pursue. It turned out they were able to conclude one. And subsequently, I think because it didn't solve everything, there was disenchantment with it. Plus, when we change administrations, and I've been through 6 of them now, watched closely changes of administration, there's a tendency and everybody's exhibited this, to throw out everything that happened, and whatever the guy who came before did can't possibly be worth anything. And that's amplified, obviously, in today's political climate even more. But it's a shame because you throw out good things, and this was.
I want to come back to your view of the world and the shift away from the non-state threats to the multipolar world and the dangerous multipolar world that you write about in this book. But come to another subject for 1 minute, the subject of your successor, JimMattis, who you know very well, I think. Could you give us your candid assessment of his tenure in the job? And give us your candid assessment of why he left.
Well, first of all, I'm going to set your expectation or condition this. He's an old friend of mine. Jim and I have known each other for 25 years. We used to sleep on the floor of the Secretary of Defense's airplane in 1993 as he flew around the world. Jim was a major. I was an assistant Secretary of Defense. Some people remembered Jim's time when he was at CENTCOM as being one when we were excessively preparing for war with Iran. Well, I worked with him almost every day.
He lost his job because of that.
Well, if that's true, maybe I should have lost my job as a consul, because I was in it with him the whole time. So the first thing I'd like to say is I think he's an excellent person. And I did not object, and I was Secretary of Defense at the time, and would have had every opportunity to express a view that because he was a retired general, he should not be Secretary of Defense. And instead, what I said was that that was not ruled out by the law. There was a slightly higher bar for doing that. But what was important about the Secretary of Defense is that he be the president's chosen. That's what civilian control really means. That when we elect a president, the president gets to pick somebody who sits on top of the military institution as the president's representative. That's an important principle. And if the president wanted JimMattis, that seemed to me to be okay. Now you say, well, I given the circumstances, obviously didn't end well for Jim. Jim resigned and then was fired. That's
which is better than the flip.
I guess so, but at any rate, it's if you can only you got to go one way or another, and you go both.
Go both ways, yeah.
But he was doing things, including things that I had started that made sense because they made sense, not because I started them. And he didn't stop them just because he was working for another administration. And that's the kind of person I tried to be as Secretary of Defense. And so I have a lot of time for his tenure. What everybody asks me is, what are all the things that didn't happen because he was there? And he's going to have to tell us that. I don't know.
Right. Is Donald Trump qualified to be Commander-in-Chief?
He certainly doesn't take advice from his Secretary of Defense. And so people have asked me just in the last few days a similar question. I've said that I wouldn't, this is completely hypothetical because I've never been asked and don't expect to be asked, but would I work for him? And I have said no, because among other reasons, he doesn't take the advice of his Secretary of Defense. Now, did Obama always take my advice? Not always, but most of the time, and I always got a respectful hearing. I worked for Weinberger. Weinberger had his issues with President Reagan. For example, President Reagan went a direction with nuclear arms control towards total disarmament and began discussing that with the Soviet Union that made Cap Weinberger apoplectic. But most of the time, Ronald Reagan listened to my boss way up there. I was very junior at the time, but I could watch. Listened to him. Bill Perry was listened to by Bill Clinton. I've never seen a circumstance in which a cabinet secretary hasn't felt that he or she was able to help the president. And your job, you don't take a job because you get offered. You certainly don't take it because of your vanity. And you don't take it just because the President of the United States called and offered you a job. I read that all the time, and one of the things I say in the book is that that's a fallacy. You take it if you believe that you can help, and you take it if you believe that you can help consistent with your own values and sense of right and wrong.
Right. Apart from his inability to or unwillingness to ask for or listen to advice, are there any other issues that cause you, as a now private citizen but former Secretary of Defense, to worry about the national security management of this country under this president?
Well, I'll name one other thing, which I say in the book, and I don't know that it comes to the standard you just described, but I don't like the conduct. I don't like the personal conduct. I don't approve of it. I'll never get used to it. It's not the kind of thing you want your children exposed to. And it's not the kind of thing we permit in the profession of arms in the military. And it's not just the president. It's become pervasive in Washington. But it's especially there. And I don't like it. I don't want to be associated with it. And I oppose conduct by public officials of that kind. And that's not a policy thing, but it's the answer to your question. And I don't mind saying that. I don't like it.
Was the incident a week or so ago with the USS McCain, did that surprise you, the way it played out?
It did, in the sense that somebody apparently if what is said actually occurred, namely that someone in the White House, not the president according to him, gave an instruction to somebody at lower levels in the Navy, not the acting Secretary of Defense, according to him. That's not unheard of when somebody at low levels in the White House gives an instruction to somebody at low levels in DOD. But it is got to be resolutely opposed by every Secretary of Defense. Weinberger used to go nuts if anybody did that kind of thing. Perry used to go nuts. Chain of command really matters. The only person who gives orders to anybody in the Department of Secretary in the Department of Defense is the President of the United States, and the only person he gives orders to is the Secretary of Defense of the United States. That is the chain of command. I'm a stickler for that. I was always a stickler for that, and this was a violation of that. Secondly, it was if it occurred, according to the way we're told, it's a violation of the non-political nature of the U.S. military. We established the U.S. military 240 years ago, and we decided not to disestablish it, even though we're a democracy, every time governments changed hand, like we disestablish a lot of the senior leadership of the government. Fair enough to do that, but we decided we were not going to disestablish, in political cycles, the military. And that's a very important principle. Again, one that I was a stickler for, and you may remember this, but some people who are here who were working for me at the time will remember that during the 2016 election and all the kaleidoscope of all the people running, I had to constantly look into a camera or to a member of Congress and say, I'm not going to answer that question because you just asked a political question. And I'm in charge of the Department of Defense. And furthermore, I'm not going to allow Joe Dunford, who is usually the uniformed officer next to me, to answer that question either. We don't do politics. On the morning after the election, I wrote a note to the department. I said, we have a new president. And the way we do things around here is that we're going to help the new president to do the best job he and his administration possibly can in national security. So I really believe all that stuff, and this was, in its appearance, both an issue of chain of command and an issue of politicization of the military. And I think I was a stickler for both.
This is probably an unfair question, unfairly large question, given that we're going to go to questions soon. But I want you to talk about this shift toward the threat from a multipolar threat from state actors, as opposed to the wars we've been in for the last decade and a half or so, non-state actors, as the preoccupation of the defense establishment.
Sure. Okay.
And give us the frame it out, and then talk about if we're ready or not for this new kind of threat, or new old kind of threat.
Let me do that in my own words, which is to take out the abstractions and put in the names. So if I may.
No, I hate abstractions.
Let's say no. I don't mean that as in any critical way.
No.
I just
Name
mean
names.
let's say that we were very preoccupied with Iraq, Afghanistan, and more recently Syria, necessarily. And I'm not making any apologies for that. I was as preoccupied as anybody else in the department during my time. When you've got forces in action, you can't be any other way. So it's a huge preoccupation for me as undersecretary, deputy secretary, and secretary. And again, I don't apologize for that, but is it a distraction? Sure it is. And yet, and it was, I dare say, for my predecessors also in the last administration, Don Rumsfeld, and I know Bob Gates, because Bob said his priority was Iraq, Iraq, and Iraq. However, during that same period, from 2000 on, it became clear to me, at least, as somebody who'd watched Russia and China for a long time, that they were not going to turn out the way we might have hoped in the 1990s. Putin's Russia was not going to be whatever Boris Yeltsin's Russia might have been hoped to be headed for in 1993. And as Jiang Zemin passed to Hu Jintao, passed to Xi Jinping, that it became clearer and clearer that the Chinese were not going to be responsible stakeholders and all that, and they weren't going to throw their lot in there. It was going to be the 100 years of humiliation, and that it's our time for a place in the strategic sun, and that was going to be the overriding strategic idea in Chinese thought, on top of being a communist dictatorship, of course. And so those two factors, preoccupation by us on the one hand, and a lot of people, not me, but a lot of people coming late to the realization of what Russia and China really meant, mean that we're a little bit behind. I don't mean any particular administration. I think
Well, there is a critique that President Obama, for various reasons, was late to the threat. Political
he was later in history, so maybe more so, but I think the previous President Bush also. But it was a consensus. There was still hope. Ash Carter's hope had gone out a little earlier, but that's maybe a psychological thing.
Apparently, you don't specialize in hope.
Well, I did. Well, I specialized in the Russia and the Russians and the Chinese. Also.
But where are we on this shift?
Well, we're in a world in which we're going to be paying more and more attention to, in the military sense, to countering China and Russia and developing the high-end capabilities that are necessary to do that, and doing a little bit of catching up for time lost for reasons I've tried to explain. And that's in high-tech areas. It's in more sort of obvious areas of warfare like space and cyber, less obvious perhaps to many people like undersea warfare, hybrid warfare, so that area in between what's clearly war and what's clearly peace that the Russians are trying to stake out as their exclusive preserve. You have to squeeze that gray stripe down to a really fine line, and be able to operate within it as adeptly as your opponents are able to. So there's a whole lot of stuff to do out there that was not part of dealing with Afghanistan or Iraq. They caused us to have to, or Al-Qaeda. We had to learn a lot. I'm proud of what we did, overall as a military. We climbed on top of those issues of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, got pretty good at it, but they're not what we need for dealing with Russia and China.
I'll go to, one follow-up on that, and then we'll go to questions. This presupposes, all of what you said presupposes that the American people or the American people believe that the United States should continue to play this global role. There are a lot of Americans, it seems, who are moving into a more quasi-isolationist, or at least very transactional understanding of global affairs. How do you convince Americans that countering Russia and China, with all the costs and dangers associated with that, how do you convince people that that's something worth doing?
Well, let's start with the China piece, where I think we're doing a pretty good job. I mean, collectively, including the current administration, at convincing people that letting China continue to go unchecked is selling our own people and our own companies, as well as our friends and allies, down the economic river. And that this, as a communist dictatorship, is a place that's able to bring political, economic, and military power to bear upon an individual American company, to bear upon an individual friend or ally, in a way that is overwhelming to them, and that our societies can't do. It's not in our nature to do it. And if we can't compete on that basis, and we mustn't compete on that basis. And what you see us now doing in the case of China is trying to put together the playbook for a competition with a communist dictatorship that we trade with. We have a playbook. It was called the Cold War. For a communist dictatorship we don't trade with, but that's not going to do us any good because we trade with China. So you see us trying out little sanctions, and first it was aluminum and steel, and now they've got a little more sophisticated, doing some Huawei stuff, talking about whether students who are paid, whose education is paid for or subsidized in part by the U.S. government, should be allowed to return back to China. These are all us looking for the chapters and passages in that integrated economic playbook for dealing with China in the future. So in that, there's an example that is not military, in which I think you see the country, and including the government, and that's true in Congress. It's not a partisan thing either. It hasn't become a partisan thing. Waking up to the proposition we've been talking about, which is that we need to get serious about China. Russia, I think people got serious about turning sour on Putin's Russia earlier, even before the 2016 election hijinks, which if you weren't disillusioned with Putin, you should have been disillusioned after that. My disillusionment occurred earlier because I've known him since 1993.
Yeah. We have mics here, 2 mics. Just raise your hand, and if you want to just drop down right here first, and then someone in the back, yeah. Go ahead.
First. Hi, I'm Michelle Munger. I'm a recently graduated high school student. My question is, how do you make strategy in a world where the media and politics is all about instant gratification?
It's a good question, and one aspect of it is clarity and consistency. I say clarity and consistency because they really work. You get bored and you have to say the same thing over and over and over again, but eventually it sinks in. Now, it turns out that those same things, clarity and consistency, work very well in the institution of the Department of Defense also, which will do what you want if you make it clear what that is and why. And so when I made a major decision, let's take the counter-ISIS campaign, and I knew that this was a country that was tired of, they say they're tired of war, although they're really just tired of watching television that has war on it. It always offends me when people say that, and you want to say just exactly what are you tired of? Right. I know people who are really tired of the war, but they're tired of watching the war. But at any rate, they want to end 2 wars. We were starting a 3rd war. That's essentially what I was proposing to do with the counter-ISIS campaign. And that's not going to win a popularity contest. You need to explain that rationale very carefully, and again, and again, and again, and again. So clarity and consistency, and then the repetition's important because it's such an ADD culture. People flit off to one thing, and I had a speechwriter at one time who used to tell me that I needed to change up my words because he said, well, you said it that way last week. And he had a literature background, and he thought it was getting boring. And maybe it was getting boring for him. But I said, no, absolutely, I'm going to say it again and again and again. And in fact, the Pentagon press corps they played Ash Carter bingo, they say, which is he going to say that we have the finest fighting force the world has ever known? You know, and would that be in a troop talk? Yes, it's going to be in a troop talk again and again and again. They're not the same troops all the time, but I'm not going to say that again and again. Lasting defeat of ISIS, lasting defeat of ISIS, yes. Again and again and again. You can't say it too much. So you got to understand the news cycle is there, but don't let that distort your behavior. But it does need to distort how you communicate.
I can't figure out. Go ahead.
Mr. Secretary, I'm Andrew Craig from the investigative news site Justice Integrity Project. My question pertains to the famous Redline era of late summer of 2013. You wrote about that in your book in a kind of general way, but you didn't describe specifically some of the more dramatic elements of that. And since you're now writing and speaking for history, I wonder if you can amplify on who was it that wanted enforcement of the red line and who opposed successfully, and what were the reasons?
Okay. I'm not going to tell you that for two reasons. Sorry. One is I'm not sure I know because I wasn't in the decision. I was a deputy at the time. And so I didn't attend all the meetings. Secondly, if you've read the book, it's not a who said what at every meeting kind of book. It's not a memoir either, for that matter. It's really a book about the Pentagon. Partly I don't remember that kind of detail, and partly I would never betray that kind of confidence. But the more serious, substantive thing is that night I was working on the strike plan, and I was sure we were going to do it. That's what a deputy does. Now, the secretary's over in the sit room having these conversations, and the president is deciding. But down where I was, it was happening. If you want me to say, I think I said this in the book, but I'm not sure. But sort of what's wrong with this picture overall? It wasn't, to my way of thinking, so much that moment. The things that I would, if I could rewind history and be the administration as a whole, do differently, is I wouldn't have laid down the red line in the first place. I think that was a not completely intentional action. History would show on the part of the administration. So first of all, don't have red lines unless you really mean it. You asked me that earlier. The last thing is, if you do something that surprises people's expectations and that goes against the Washington playbook, you have to explain that. You can't say that, I don't need to explain that if you're too dumb to figure out why I did that in the first place. And I think there was a lot of the tone of the discussion afterwards was people saying, hey, red lines are kind of important. Could you tell us why you went through a red line? And the response was, oh, you guys are so orthodox, and you can't do that, I think. I think if you do something that is unexpected and that could be construed in the wrong way, you need to go to some considerable length to explain why it's okay. That wasn't done. Instead, that question was treated disdainfully. And so it sticks in people's memory, and what wouldn't have to have been such a self-inflicted wound for the United States became more of one because we didn't explain it. So I'd back up from that night, but I just told you where I was that night, which is why I can't tell you who shot John, and I wouldn't anyway.
Mr. Secretary, my name is Joe Reddix. I'm out of Hanover, Maryland, near NSA. I see a troubling problem with maintaining or even enhancing our coalition partners. Or are we headed toward only I can fix it scenarios?
Yes. The question is, can we really rely on, and do we believe we can rely on friends and allies? And that's a really good question. It gets back to Jeff's one about, are friends and allies worth having in the first place? To these people who want to withdraw from the world or who are tired of our friends and allies, I would say, first of all, you really need to respect that question, because let's be clear, many Americans think that alliances are favors we do for foreigners and not a real transaction in which we get something back. I don't believe that. I believe they are force multipliers. I believe, furthermore, in international life, as in ordinary human life, in relationships as a category that supersedes transactions, but includes transactions accumulated over time. So I believe in those allied reactions. I believe in the values that underlie them. Okay? Just look at the world and say, who do you want to share the future with in terms of an overall political destiny? Europe or China or Russia? And I'd pick Europe, and I think that that's a meaningful judgment. Now, they don't always do what we want, and they don't nearly contribute enough. This is the standing beef with NATO over the NATO budget, and I'm sure you and your job are very familiar with that. Every Secretary of Defense I have ever known, including myself, has banged their shoe on their table at NATO about NATO contributions, and there's nothing nice to say about the NATO defense budgets. They're not okay. That doesn't cause me to want to abandon the playing field either. When you get to partners like the Iraqi security forces, the Afghan security forces, are they frustrated? Yeah. But you got to understand why you're doing this in the first place. And I'm for staying in the game. If you want to get to Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, I'm a stayer in all three of those cases. And that's debated and so forth, and we don't have time to go into each one of those situations here. But just summing it up, I'm a stayer with them. And that's not just because I won't stop doing something I've been doing for a while and sacrificed a lot of blood and treasure for. It's because I continue to think it's worthwhile, and that if we leave the field, we're going to have to do something that will be worse for our security later.
Are you a stayer in the U.S.-Saudi relationship? And speak extra loudly, because they're right
That's
over
fine.
there.
That's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
No,
Just project that way.
I'm a stayer, but I'm a resetter. And I kind of say this in the book. I'm just on the stayer part, I am not, despite my frustrations, which I'm about to enumerate with the Saudis, that doesn't add up to a forget you. Right. But it does add up to driving a much harder bargain. Let me tell you what some of my frustrations are. They have not come through for us militarily on several opportunities when they might have, the counter-ISIS campaign being one of them. Didn't even come through when I said, okay, let's not do the military, let's do the time-honored Saudi way, just get out your wallet. And even that, they wouldn't come through, and didn't come through in a big way. And I was frustrated with that, because they should share that objective, and at least as a partner, they should respect that it was an overwhelming objective for the United States and in Europe. Overwhelming for me, because I have to protect my people against these barbarians. And so they have to be defeated. That's my view. And if you're with us in the Gulf, and you're with us in general in the Middle East, I'd like to see a little respect for what is a strategic imperative on my part, which is to protect my my people, and that offended me. When Adel al-Jaber suggests that they're doing us a favor by buying our arms, that as the former arms buyer and exporter, and I'm all for arms sales, because they subsidize our industry to the benefit of the DoD, and they help our international partners, so they're a twofer. I'm all for it. But it's not a gift, it's a transaction. It's not a favor, it's a transaction. And if they think that they're doing us a favor by buying their naval enhancement program, which is a Raytheon program or something, they think they're doing us a favor, they ought to ask for a lower price. That's kind of where my thinking. So it's not a favor, it's a transaction, and that's neutral. So this idea that somehow, which they seem to have convinced the president of early on, maybe he doesn't believe this anymore, that it's a great gift to have them as a friend and ally. I want them as a friend and ally, okay? But it's not a great gift. It's got to be a fair deal, and I think I'd reset the relationship a little bit, particularly since, of course, the oil isn't what it was in the 70s.
Right. There was a question back there. I think this is going to be our last question, unfortunately, because we want to get to some book signings.
Sure. Good evening, Secretary Carter. On behalf of everyone in the room, I wanted to say thank you so much for your time tonight. As a former Pentagon officer, I wanted to ask and highlight a couple things that you've brought up tonight. China and Russia, competition, and where our current focus is and perhaps where it should have been. Given the conclusion of the House Armed Services Committee today deliberating the budget, referencing a former titan of the community, how much is enough? How much do we need to actually gain, maintain, or regain that competitive advantage for the Defense Department?
Okay, good question. And to get to today's reference, the amounts being debated now are so small relative to the 750 overall that I don't think that's a good benchmark. So the question is 750 enough? I think that we can make good use of all that money. So I'm not somebody who's going to tell you the defense budget is too big, and that's not just because I've been Secretary of Defense. I'm not going to also tell you it's all used well. Sometimes it's not, but I think it can be used well, and I was committed, and I hope my successors will be committed to using it well. It hasn't been politics of the partisan sort throughout our history that has largely determined the size of the budget either. Next. So, for example, one of the things I noted in the book is that Dick Cheney presided over the largest reduction in the defense budget in history, not because Dick wanted to, or any Secretary of Defense would have wanted to, but because the strategic bottom fell out of his case with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he and Colin Powell scrambled to put together the two major regional contingencies rationale to try to put a floor under what was the collapse of the defense budget. In my most recent time, the biggest determinant, the biggest dynamic of the defense budget wasn't Republican or Democrat, it was deficit hawks. And that is what led to the threat of sequester, to the caps, to the budget turmoil, to the fact that in 7 of 8 years of my serving that administration, we never got a budget at the beginning of the fiscal year. The executive branch always asked for more money than we ever got from Congress. I mean, it was backwards from what people normally think the dynamics are. And another thing you should keep in mind, I'm sorry this is a long answer, but it's a big budget, is that we pay our people well because they're good and they're volunteers, and other militaries don't. So our manpower bill is substantial. It goes up considerably every year at COLA or above. Our health care bill goes up above COLA, as it does for in many other enterprises around the country. And so I think the budgets that are being asked for on either side, and they're all within spitting distance of one another. If you ask me whether I could put that much money to good use strategically and whether I think we will, my answer is yes.
Secretary Carter, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We'll be book signing outside. Thank you.